When you are world building your fantasy universe, you are often showered by a myriad of different advice and tips on how to make your world feel better and more immersive. But all that input can leave you guessing, and that will very quickly kill your creativity. I know, because I've been there. I've made some pretty bad mistakes in the past, mistakes that cost me years of my writing progress, and I wish someone had warned me sooner. So let's not waste any more time. The first and the biggest mistake that I see, especially lately, is what I call the geographical Puritanism. If you've been around world building for some time, you've probably already heard that advice that a good fantasy map should be geographically accurate, that mountain ranges should follow the tectonic plates, and rivers should always flow through the natural formations of them. Now, I'm not a contrarian, I'm not here to tell you that you should never ever do that. But let me show you something. Let's say you want to grow paprika. You always wanted to grow a paprika farm, and obviously you know nothing about it. So what do? Well, you start listening to people who are more experienced than you in farming, right? So you find some people who have 2 decades of experience in farming, and they tell you how to do that. And your crops fail over and over again. But those people that you ask for advice, they keep saying to you that you should continue on, that something is wrong with you, not with the advice. The problem is, all they ever knew how to farm is garlic. Their 2 decades of experience in farming is farming garlic. And if you know any basics of farming, you know that paprika and garlic, the way you grow them is completely different. Now, how does that relate to world building and writing? Just like farming is a general broad umbrella of just growing crops out of the ground, world building and writing are also very broad umbrella term for fictional world building and writing. The way you make a dark science fiction universe is completely different than creating a fairy tale high fantasy universe. And so if a realistic and geographically accurate fantasy map is for you, for your world, great, go for it. But remember, we are talking about fantasy and fiction. You can create literally anything as long as it is internally consistent. In fantasy, you have magic and fantastical phenomenon that doesn't make sense in our world, but it might do in your world. Maybe your world doesn't have tectonic plates and it's just a set of floating islands in the sky. Maybe mountain ranges in your world are spines of giant monstrosities that died a long time ago, just like dinosaurs in our world, but much, much bigger. So big that they created their own geographical mark in your world. To give you a pretty good example of this, recently I've watched this 13-hour Bionicle lore video. Please don't judge, I was sick for 3 weeks. I had nothing else to do. And from that video I learned that the Bionicle world consists of just 2 islands, but besides that it's an oceanic planet, with most of the story taking place either on one of those islands or underground in the vast cave networks with artificial suns and artificial life below the ground. But then, huge reveal. The main island at the beginning of the story takes place is actually a phase of a slumbering colossal robot. In the underground cave networks with artificial life and suns, well, those are his organs. That was such a bold and unique idea that at the same time also made sense within the confines of the story, but also it made retroactively all the stories before made so much more sense, so much more interesting. So remember, you're writing fantasy and fiction. You can go wild with your ideas as long as they benefit your story. The next world-building mistake is lore overload. Now don't get me wrong, lore is a very important part of world building. If world building is made out of bricks, then lore is the mortar that hold those bricks together. The problem starts when you pour so much lore into your audience that they start to drown in it. I mean, props to you if you are so passionate about your world that you wrote all of that stuff. But if you want to publish your work, if you want that work to be seen by someone else than just you, then that is a big mistake. By overloading your audience with lore, you will not only cause lore fatigue, you will introduce so many things, so many names, and so many kingdoms and factions that they will just become disinterested, they'll be confused. So here's the solution without undermining your work. Sometimes what you don't say can be more powerful than what you do say. Restricting your in-universe lore can create an aura of mysticism and intrigue. Just look at any successful fictional world. In every single one of them, you will find cryptic, mysterious parts of the broader lore that spark interest and theories and speculations. You have YouTube channels dedicated to that specific lore theories. Now, I'm not suggesting to cheat and to create empty mystery boxes, and I guess that would be mistake number 2.5. Don't make empty mystery boxes. Because an empty mystery box is not only cheap and lazy, it is also a giant betrayal and insult to the audience that you gather, the people who actually care about your world. Now, where does the extensive lore that you've written come up in this solution? Now what you can do, you can create a mystery and withhold information from the audience, but at the same time, it's not cheap because the answer exists. You already written it. And so because the answer already exists and it's already written somewhere, you can now put or just sprinkle around your world building and your story some clues about what is actually the mystery. And that way you make the search for answers in your world building much more exciting for people. Who knows, maybe at some point you will have dedicated YouTube channels discussing lore and different mysteries in your fantasy universe. The next world building mistake is what I call Earth 2.0. It's when a fantasy world feels like a cheap copy-paste of our own planet with some dragons and wizards sprinkled around the top. Look, I get it. Earth is familiar, and familiarity can be a good starting point, especially if you have never written or created a world ever before. A good and big example of that mistake is the Warhammer Fantasy world. If you look at the map, it's practically a photocopy of Europe. Albion is Britain, Bretonnia is France, the Empire is Germany, Kislev is Eastern Europe, and so on and so on. I mean, sure, you have chaos gods, you have orcs, you have the undead, you have vampires, you have dwarves, but the geography feels like a lazy reskin of just our own world. There's enough new things to not make it too lazy and too cheap, and it was also a world that was created in the 80s and 90s, so it kinda gets a pass because of that. But if you're aiming for something truly original, something that will truly stand out from the myriads of other Earth 2.0 copy-pasted worlds, why bother yourself with a blueprint that everyone already knows? The fix here is very simple. Just break the mold. Your world doesn't need Earth's cultural templates or settlement patterns. Maybe your societies thrive in sprawling treetop cities woven from living vines, and the vast majority of your world maybe live on those trees. But going to the ground level is very dangerous. The ground level is very dark. The sun doesn't pierce through the giant and thick foliage. And there are dangerous beasts roaming around, and demons and maybe other stuff. And that can change a lot of things in your universe, because now iron and rocks and basically all metals are very, very rare commodities, because there is very few people who dare to go to the ground level to mine for those things. And so the richest people in your world might have weapons made out of iron. Maybe their jewelry is made out of rocks and pieces of iron and copper. Something that is common and normal in a normal fantasy world, but in your world that is something huge. Sure, at the end of the day, this is your world and you can do whatever you want. However, if you want your world to stand out from hundreds, if not thousands of others that are just like that, then you need to break the mold and do something truly original. Next one is the lack of lore consequences. This happens when your world building feels like a bunch of cool ideas thrown together without any consideration of how they interact with each other. Think of it like this. Every piece of your world, geography, cultures, and the deeper lore, should echo each other. A war between two major nations shouldn't just end with a peace treaty and everyone going home like nothing just had happened. You should think about the deeper consequences of such events. Maybe it leaves behind a scarred, desolated wasteland that now attract deserters and other marauders and bandits. More and more people will leave the neighboring regions because it's dangerous now, and so this place will expand slowly but surely. Maybe those two nations are now too exhausted to fight off those bands of marauders. And at some point, maybe there will be a marauding warlord who will unite all of those bands and form some kind of a nation, a new threat that now is a new faction in this region. Consequences tie your ideas together. They make your world more alive, more cohesive and immersive. You can constantly evolve your world by doing this. This is actually a very good cure for stagnation in your lore. The trick is to ask yourself, what happens next? Every single time you introduce something new to your world and to your lore. If you introduce a cataclysmic event, for example, a giant comet crashing into the ocean, ask yourself, what happens next? Maybe all the coastal cities vanish because they are destroyed in the tidal wave that the comet caused. Maybe a giant empire had its economy destroyed because those coastal cities were crucial to its trade. And now other smaller countries that didn't suffer that much might, attack this bigger empire because it is weakened, this economy is crippled. Maybe a new religion arises, venerating the space and the cosmos and the stars, saying that this comet falling from the sky was a sign from the gods above, and that new religion will now cause a division, a new religious war, maybe a civil war. There's so many other consequences that it can cause. When your world has consequences, it stops being a collection of parts and starts feeling like a whole new living, breathing world. And the last mistake is invisible magic. That's what I call where people create magic systems in their world building, but they don't really think how to implement it truly in the world, how people will react with it, especially if the magic is common. Picture this. If magic exists in your world, and it's not that uncommon, it's not rare, for example, like in the Dungeons and Dragons setting, right, in Faerun, do you think that it will not affect the everyday life of every single person that lives in this universe? Because I guarantee you that it will absolutely shape the economy, the way people wage war, the everyday life of just normal citizens, agriculture, basically everything. Let's say your fantasy world has teleportation magic, right? Just like in Dungeons and Dragons and Faerun. Don't you think it will very heavily affect how trade, for example, is done? If merchants can just zap their goods from one point to another, then why would they ever bother with ships, with caravans? Even if that teleportation magic is expensive, well, the time that it takes to transport those goods from one place of a country to another and ignoring all those dangers around, it's still way more profitable to do it. And this has way bigger consequences. First of all, what would bandits do in the roads? Would they just attack villages normally? Or would they target something else? What about the coastline cities? Because coastline cities in medieval style fantasy are usually the richest because they are usually the trade hubs of the sea routes that are around them. And now when you can teleport your goods, what's the point of those coastal cities? Probably, if teleportation magic is very common, those coastal cities will be pretty obscure. They will be just fishing towns mostly. And now economical hubs and rich cities that connect everything would be cities with extensive teleportation network and services. What about healing magic, which is also very, very often utilized in fantasy universes? If healing will be accessible to almost anyone, will doctors even exist? Or even if they exist, they will probably be only for very, very poor, backwards places where there's not that many mages. If that is the case, childbirth will probably also be a breeze, so the population numbers will probably skyrocket. And if the population numbers will skyrocket, how will this affect the agriculture and the food supply? Because more people means you need more food. And how healing magic will affect plants? Can you heal plants? Maybe that will also improve agriculture. There's so many consequences that magic can have in a fantasy world, especially if it's very prevalent. So here's the fix for that. If you want to have that magic system that is pretty common in your universe, you really want to do that, you need to put a lot of work to think about how it affects everything, both in terms of economy, how people wage war, how does it affect religion, how does it affect culture and the society, etc., etc. Or if you don't want to do it, you feel a bit overwhelmed, you need to heavily limit that magic to only very few people, because then you don't need to think about that many consequences. And if you struggle a lot finding consequences and how people will abuse magic in your universe, because people can have very wild and crazy ideas that you probably didn't think about, then create an RPG campaign set in your own world and invite people that, especially that you trust, and people who will be very crazy with ideas, and tell them, guys, go crazy. Just abuse this magic system as much as you can. Don't be a shitty game master. Don't be angry at them that they abuse your system. That is the goal. That is the exercise. And if you cannot find people like that, or you don't want to test with randos and you don't have friends to play with, well, you can always write a comment under this video, ask people for advice, and maybe some people will answer, maybe I will answer if you struggle finding any consequences for your magic system. And in addition, if you want to learn more about a very specific, narrow topic, subject of world building and writing, instead of, binge watching clickbaity videos like this one, you can check my playlist here. And that is all for today. See you when I see you.